Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest Legal Committee webinar. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping for attendees. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available on NUCA's YouTube channel that can be accessed via the front page of NUCA.com. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, you can submit a written question anytime using the chat feature, and I'll read them at the conclusion of our discussion. Now let's get started. Crafting effective pre-bid questions is critical for utility construction contractors to ensure successful infrastructure project outcomes. These questions clarify project scope, specifications, and potential risks, reducing costly misunderstandings. By asking about site conditions, timelines, material requirements, and regulatory constraints, contractors can accurately assess before bidding a project's feasibility and potential costs. In today's latest Legal Committee webinar, we'll hear from Tom Olson on how strategic pre-bid and pre-construction inquiries enhance project planning, mitigate risks, and position contractors for success in complex infrastructure projects. Tom Olson is well known to NUCA members as a voice of authority on construction law. Tom is chairman of the NUCA Legal Committee and practices law in Minnesota as founding partner of Olson Construction Law PC. His firm works exclusively for contractors around the country on project change issues. Thank you for joining us today on this NUCA Legal Committee webinar. Tom, I turn the webinar over to you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure, folks, to be on conducting this webinar. I've been practicing for 40 years right now around the country, and it's really imbues my advice and sharing that I'm going to give today. So while I'm a lawyer, my role around the country is to help contractors, cooperatively, fairly resolve issues on the job site and ideally even avoid the issues altogether. So I put together, based upon my experience, important questions to answer. And if you don't have them answered, to be aware that that uncertainty should inform you, one, as to whether or not you should bid the job, and two, if you're bidding it, how to price it. So mindful of that, we'll get going here. Next. All right. A little background for me though folks don't know me as well. I've got a little law firm. We know a lot about a little, and the little happens to be construction. We know highway heavy, vertical and horizontal, with the emphasis on the below grade portion of it. I'm a geotech wannabe, so really have taken on learning from a technical standpoint how soils react and how different soils can affect contractors. All right, next. That's me, getting old, getting gray. That's me. All right, let me share a little bit more of those folks that are part of our team here. Next. We're a small firm, myself and two other partners. The three of us all specialize in one area, which is, construction, again, with the emphasis on getting yes at the outset rather than trying to change no. We've got a couple of great gals in support of making our efforts successful. All right, next. Again, my passion, our passion, is really helping to make best practices better. And, we do that within the sector of construction with, again, a heavy emphasis on the below grade portion. All righty, next. As Robert said at the beginning, the importance of this questions is really tied to evaluating plan costs. How do I bid this job? What are the costs should anticipate and fold into my bid, as well as two, given how the subgrade has been investigated or not investigated, or otherwise what the investigated shows, what's the likelihood of potential unplanned costs? And three, to the extent that I encounter unplanned costs, what are my rights to payment for those? All righty, next. So the key is recognizing a tool that I think contractors also or often don't recognize that's in their tool chest, which is the opportunity to ask questions both at the pre-bid as well as the pre-construction phase. And to recognize that, again, there's no reason to be sheepish about asking those questions. Again, questions are focused on assessing and evaluating risk, whether it means how to price work, or in some cases, the risk might be uncertain or great enough that you might decide not to bid the job altogether. Again, all about managing risk, and today is a roadmap giving what questions to ask, when, and from whom. All righty, next. So at the pre-bid phase, these are questions that you should consider asking the engineer, be it bidding as a GC or as a sub. And these questions, as it relates to the subgrade, the soils and the groundwater, really are related to, in part, setting you up to know, one, the likelihood of encountering differing site conditions, and two, if you encounter differing site conditions, how is the engineer likely to respond with regard to whether it's going to cooperate with you to fairly resolve a DSC claim, or whether or not the engineer is likely to push back on it. So mindful of that, these are questions, again, that you should consider asking. And again, each of the questions that I'm going to go through it that you should ask at the pre-bid phase are also questions that if you're not asking them, then you should certainly be asking them at the pre-con phase. All right, first, again, did the engineer request a subgrade investigation for the project? Now, certainly if you got soil borings, soils report for the project, it would be the engineer that requested it. So while you might say, well, if I've got site-specific subgrade investigation, certainly the engineer has requested it. It's an important question to ask the engineer in order that the engineer is responsible for, as well as recognizing that that subgrade investigation happened because the engineer requested it. And the reason the engineer in the first part is requesting it is not for the contractor bidding on it, but rather for the engineer to be evaluating what the subgrade conditions are for purposes of how to design the subgrade components. So be it pipe, whether it be soil stabilization, whether it be footings, whatever it is, the engineer is commissioning that subgrade investigation, the first part, for the engineer's benefit to design the work. And that's why it's important to recognize that the next question, which is, did the engineer provide all of its subgrade investigation, which it relied upon, or otherwise generate as part of its initial design investigation? It's an important question to ask because whether you realize it or not, it's very often the case that owners, engineers are not sharing all of their subgrade information. In fact, based upon a federal highway survey that was done of DOTs around the country, when the question was asked of DOTs, how often do you share all of your project-specific subgrade investigation information? The answer was probably more than half of the DOTs said they do not share all of their information, which sounds incredulous to me. But in any case, recognizing that it's more of a norm rather than an exception, where a project owner / engineer is not sharing all of the subgrade information, which is certainly going to be relevant for you, both evaluating risk, determining how to price it, as well as whether to bid it at all. You need to make sure that if the engineer, well, stop that. That's why you need to be asking as a matter of course for a project, in my opinion, as a standard question, if not at the pre-bid, certainly at the pre-con phase. Mr. Engineer, have you provided me all the subgrade information that you generated for this project or otherwise relied upon? Because often what you'll learn, for example, is as part of the subgrade investigation at the design phase, the engineer is not only generating, evaluating information for the subgrade investigation then being conducted, but also it may be relying upon, for example, soil borings that were taken if you're adding on to existing or otherwise replacing the subgrade investigation that was generated previously. Similarly, the engineer may be relying upon geographic information that's specific to that area, all of which is relevant information for you in evaluating risk as well as bidding. And again, if the engineer responds that it is not, certainly you want to ask, well, can you get me this stuff? Next. Because the engineer has an obligation per which recognized literally through all the states or throughout the country, an implied duty to provide all relevant project data. So when the engineer / owner is not providing everything they have or otherwise refusing to do that, that's in direct violation of an implied duty. Implied meaning while that duty is not expressly set forth in the contract documents, courts have established that duty as a matter of law. So having it been established by the courts, it's treated as being part of the contract with the same import as though it was expressly written in the contract, which is to say you have an absolute right for all of the subgrade information that's either been generated by an engineer and or considered as part of the evaluation of for that project with the design. This next question is an important one, and it's one you want to make sure you ask again at the pre-bid, the pre-con stage. Does the engineer believe the subgrade investigation accurately reflects the anticipated subgrade information for your work? Now, if you ask that question before there is a DSC claim, you're going to get what normally would be the accurate answer, which is yes. But again, you want to have that question asked and answered, and certainly you want to make sure that answer is in writing. That's important for another number of reasons. Let's say, for example, I've got borings that are not in the horizontal location of my work. In other words, if I was doing my work in the embankment, those borings would be great, but that's not where I'm doing it. Yet if the borings that I get are in a horizontal location other than where I did the work, the question is, do I have a right to rely upon those borings that are reflected at a different horizontal location for the work that I'm doing? Again, you want to ask that, get an answer. Ideally, you'd be asking a question that's important about that as the pre-bid phase. Similarly, if the borings are at a different vertical location, let's say they don't extend down to your work. I've seen in a lot of combined pavement utility projects where the borings do not extend to the depth of the utility work, and therefore it's fair to assume they were done for the paving work. However, they're provided for all of the work on the basis that, based upon my experience and the reasonable assumption that you as a contractor performing the utility work should rely upon those borings, notwithstanding that they do not extend to the vertical depth of your work. Again, critical to ask for the soils information that you got. Do you have a right to rely upon that information wherever the borings are taken, however many there are, that those borings accurately reflect the condition that you should anticipate for the work that you're doing at your vertical and horizontal location? And that should include not only the soils, but the groundwater level. Again, I've had a lot of differing site condition claims over the years based upon groundwater levels, and you got the typical disclaimer in the soils report that the soil groundwater levels can change seasonally. Yet when the engineer is designing a project and preparing the engineer's estimate of cost, I can assure you, based upon my experience, the engineer is relying upon the groundwater levels shown in the borings as what you should anticipate encountering. Again, to ensure that you're on the same page and understanding how to bid the job, you want to be asking these questions ideally at the ones that I'm going through now at the pre-bid phase, and certainly at the pre-con stage. Again, the beauty is by asking them before there's a differing site condition claim, it's a lot easier to get agreement as well as reasonable answers. And the last one is a critically important one. Hey, do I have a right to rely upon the soils information you gave me? And that's critical because we know standard part of below grade work is you're given the soils information to rely upon, then you got those disclaimers that either limit your right to rely upon that information whole or part, when in fact we all know the soils information is given you for one reason and one reason alone, which is to rely upon it. So again, you want to ask that question, and I will offer that if the engineer pushes back saying you shouldn't, a great comeback question is to ask, well, let me ask you a question, Mr. Engineer. When you design the project, did you rely upon it as being accurate? Ideally, ask that question when you're staring the engineer in the face to see their struggle on it. And then the engineer certainly would say yes. The engineer says no. Okay, well, If you didn't rely upon it, then why did you provide it as part of the contract documents? It's going to give you leverage right away. Assuming the engineer answers honestly, which is he did rely upon it, then the question should be, if you relied upon it at the design phase, how did it become inaccurate, unreliable for me to rely upon it when you handed it off to me at the bidding phase? And by the way, I see a question here. All the information related to the subgrade investigation should be provided, be it the borings, the soils report, and again, past soils reports, past soil borings, geological information, anything that's been assembled, evaluated, relied upon, all of that as a matter of law should be provided to you. And again, knowing that it's often, if not regularly, not provided in whole part, you've got to make sure, in my opinion, as part of standard operating procedure, to make a written request to get that information and require a response from the engineer be in writing. Okay, next. Let's turn from the soils, the groundwater level, to utilities in terms of important questions to ask, if not at the pre-bid, certainly at the pre-con phase, because certainly one of the biggest factors that it can impact cost, time, constructability are utilities. All right. And as I've learned, when the engineer, as a matter of standard operating procedure, looks to identify the existence of utilities at the design phase as part of its one call, the engineer standard practice around the country is to look to utility companies for information on whether and what extent there are utilities that may be in the way of the contemplated below grade construction, which, by the way, is really not the best way to do it. The best way is for the engineer to look internally to the owner's own records as to the existence of utilities that may interfere with construction. Because when a utility is granted the right to place a utility in public property, that's done pursuant to an easement utility agreement, which then is either registered with the county recorder's office as a property interest and or reflected as part of an ordinance. So again, and ideally, when an engineer is getting utility information, one way to help engineers' best practices get better is to recommend that the engineer be utilizing the owner's own utility-related agreements at the outset to determine the existence of utilities. Again, the practice around the country is 99.99% of engineers do not utilize the best evidence of utilities that might interfere, which is the owner's own record. So good to ask that. And if the engineer is not doing that, to recommend, as a matter of course, going forward, the engineer utilize those records. If the engineer did not utilize those, you want to recommend the engineer obtain those, certainly if you're asking at the pre-bid phase. And you want to know if the engineer did not obtain them, why not, and that recommend the engineer get them. And I'd also want to ask is for the utilities that you understand may interfere with the construction, may need to be relocated. Are there any utilities of that sort for which the engineer does not have or has not obtained any sort of utility-related agreements? Again, this is an area that I've learned about and seeking to develop in terms of a best practice for engineers, contractors around the country, which is the best way at the outset to avoid utility interference, as well as the need for utility relocation, is to get an accurate accounting of existing utilities and their locations. And that means using the owner's records, not the utility companies, because as I've learned, certainly from a landmark case against CenturyLink, utility companies' records are incomplete, inaccurate, just terrible. All right, next. Again, if you want to ask the engineer for the agreements, did you review them? Did you utilize them to determine the location? What's important about those agreements too, and again, this is an important sharing here that you might not be aware of. As I like to say, there's three things you can count on in life: death, taxes, and late utility relocation. Part of the problem we have with why we have late utility relocation is twofold. One, we don't have accurate information on the existence of utilities that might interfere. And two, once we find out where they are, Utilities don't cooperate typically to relocate when we need it done because nobody's got a contract with them, except that there is a quasi contract available that neither engineers nor contractors normally are aware of, which is these agreements that are executed when the utility is originally granted the right to place their lines in public properties. Those agreements, which are embodied either in the agreement themselves or often in an ordinance, an applicable city county ordinance, those agreements, if not typically, I'd say more often than not, include both rights and obligations in those agreements. One, they will often indicate a duty of the utility to relocate within a stated period of time upon request of the owner. It will say either within a stated number of days or within, in quotes, a reasonable period of time. So that gives leverage in an area where historically neither engineers nor contractors have leverage. And again, you've got to make it a standard operating procedure, certainly at the pre-con, prior to the pre-con meeting, to make sure you're getting all of those agreements from the engineer if you're not getting them at the pre-con, at the pre-bid phase. And two, a lot of those agreements provide that if the utility fails to relocate upon request within a stated period of time, that the utility is responsible for the extra construction related costs. And I will tell you, having spoken on this topic on different places around the country, I'm happy to report that I was recently talking to a consulting engineer who utilized those agreements. And while it didn't result in, and use it both on a city project level as well as on a DOT projects, that when the utilities were relocating, the engineer utilized those agreements, which included obligation to relocate upon request, included an obligation to pay if that was not done, utilize those agreements to not only pay for the engineer owner's extra costs, but also for the contractors. So there's a great opportunity around this area to transform the practice around the country to both minimize late utility relocation and when it occurs from the contractor as well as the engineer standpoint, have the utility pay for those costs without having to either eat them or otherwise get into a lawsuit. Okay. And what's important you want to find out is, did the engineer communicate with the utilities when construction would begin? I've experienced many cases many projects where one of the reasons, if not the primary reason, the late utility relocation is occurring is because the engineer did not communicate during the design phase when construction was scheduled to begin. So again, you want to make sure at the pre-bid phase, hey, have you told the utilities, can we email the power? You will get this, you will get all of the information. Somebody just asked, can you get this information? We'll make sure through Robert or me, we get this whole PowerPoint presentation to you. Okay. All right. So again, you want to know, has the engineer communicated to the utilities, hey, when you need to relocate, mindful of when the project's going to begin. All right, next. Okay. And again, while the law and standard practices varies from state to state, again, it's important to find out the extent to which the engineers communicate with the utilities, which lines need to be relocated, when they need to be relocated, as well as based upon the utility agreements, the easements, what are the financial consequences the utilities that have failed to do that, as well as has the engineer provided copies of the agreements to the utility companies during the design phase. Again, all of this is going to relate to practices that should be those applied by engineers around the country, but I can assure you, based upon my experience, none of the engineers are. So again, this is a great area to really have contractors helping engineers make their practices a whole lot better to minimize the problem of late utility relocation. Again, I was also saying that for often the case, certainly on city and county projects, as well as states, there's an ordinance that can apply that can also include, similar to the utility related agreement itself, obligations to relocate within a stated period of time, as well as financial consequences if the engineer fails to. So if I'm the contractor, when I'm looking to bid a job, I would just Google up, for the county, city in which I'm looking at, whatever that city county name is, as well as utility relocation. And then that's a really easy way to find out whether or not there's any applicable ordinances that can establish duties of the utilities to relocate with a stated period of time, as well as financial consequences if they fail to do that. All right, next. It's important to ask the engineer too, again, if not at the pre-bid phase, certainly prior to the pre-con, have the utilities agreed to relocate when requested, as well as finding out from the engineer, have you even requested, an approximate time frame when you're going to require relocation? And that's all part of, asking the engineer, have you communicated to the utilities the approximate start date of when the project will begin, and therefore when, plus or minus utilities need to be relocated. And again, one thing you want to find out is for all the communications, the commitments that have been made as it relates to utility relocation, more specifically the timing of that, has the engineer disclosed all of that information by way of the project specific conditions, which will normally be in the special or supplemental conditions. Again, these are important questions to ask because my experience around the country is, as it relates to the soils information as well as the utilities, engineers are very lax in properly evaluating the subgrade, as well as sharing the subgrade related information, as well as working with utilities to get the existence of utilities that may conflict and therefore require relocation, as well as communicating with utilities about the need, as well as the timing for utility relocation. And again, you might say, gosh, this is a lot of questions to ask. You don't need to ask them, but you should just be mindful of when you're bidding, how much to bid, and deciding whether to bid at all. Without having this information, be mindful of your bidding or not without critical information that relates to risks that you're assuming and how to price it or not to bid at all. All right. And again, I think that 14th, question is a critical one, be it at the pre-bid or at the pre-con phase. You want to specifically ask the engineer for all agreements that the owner has for utility agreements, easements. And again, you have a right to get that information because, again, as a matter of law, there's an implied duty literally recognized in all jurisdictions around the country for the owner to provide all of its subgrade related information, because that's all relevant information for you bidding the work, pricing it. And therefore you have a right to get that information, while the engineer has a corresponding duty to disclose it. If anybody has pushback on that, give me a call, because I would anticipate pushback, because standard practice is not to provide that information. In fact, I'm not aware of any project in which an engineer has shared, just as it would share soil borings, soils reports, with the engineer sharing as part of the contract documents, the easements, or any utility related agreements. So we got to work together to make it a standard practice for the engineer to do what it's obligated as a matter of law, which is to share that information. And if you don't get it the pre-bid phase, you certainly got to make sure you get it the pre-con. And I'm happy to help out people as part of a free phone call, again, to the extent that we help establish, appropriate engineering practices in these areas for projects in your area. It's a lot easier to build on that practice, becoming more uniform around the country. And when you have success doing that, I would really encourage you to share that success through the portals, through NUCA, so we can build on it and to get a roadmap from you, what steps you took to successfully accomplish that, as well as if you have had pushback, share it with NUCA too, so we on the legal committee can help you to overcome those problems. Again, we're doing regular webinars as well as articles, so we can certainly address that. And part of what you get as being a NUCA member is this level of legal assistance without having to necessarily pay for it. All right, next. Okay, this again, I'm at the bid phase. Question for the contractors bidding team, be it as a GC or as a sub. Is there a differing site condition clause? Certainly if there's federal funds on a project, the feds, require a differing site condition clause. It's included in literally Other than I think in one state, North Carolina, and the DOT specs um, for the below grade work, there's not a differing site condition clause. I don't know how they can do that on a project with federal funds, but while the differing site condition clause, the DSC clause, is standard in most contracts, it's not in all of them. So particularly, sometimes you'll see it absent on a city, you can see it absent on a county project. You need to make sure to evaluate at the pre-bid phase, is there, excuse me, a DSC clause? Because if there's not, as a matter of law, courts generally hold around the country that in the absence of one, even if you encounter subgrade conditions different, that's what's shown in a soils report or soil borings for the project you're bidding on, you as a contractor assume that risk. It seems very unfair, but just be mindful of, a lot of courts have held that. Now, I've gotten around that problem on projects that did not have a DSC clause by characterizing the need for the work because of unanticipated subgrade conditions as being properly characterized as extra work, work that was not anticipated at the time the job was designed. So I've successfully utilized that. I've only had occasion to successfully utilize it at a cooperative phase, not in courts. So if you do find yourself having gotten a contract without recognizing that there was not a DSC clause in there, and you run into unanticipated subgrade conditions, give me a call. First call is free on anything, and I can help you sort of guide you through on how to utilize the extra work clause to hopefully get that issue resolved. Alternatively, I had a project in North Dakota where we ran into unanticipated subgrade conditions. There was not a DSC clause. The contractor called me right away. And what we did was I worked behind the scenes, but we, working with the contractor, we encouraged the engineer to conduct further subgrade investigation to see if we could find what would be the anticipated subgrade conditions. The engineer agreed to do that. Soil borings were taken. The contractor assisted with using or providing a bucket to excavate some of the material. We were successful in finding the anticipated subgrade conditions at a different horizontal and vertical location. The project was able to be redesigned at the different horizontal vertical locations in the anticipated subgrade conditions, whereby the contractor did not incur the extra costs. And notably, the contractor was paid additional monies for the additional lineal feet that was required for the pipe to be done at a different location. Back to the questions asked of your team at the bidding phase. What does it state in the contract with regard to the right to rely upon the subgrade information that's provided? That information is normally included in the special or supplemental conditions, not in the general conditions as to your right to rely upon it. So you got to make sure that you're evaluating that, and be mindful of the fact that even if you've got disclaimers in the contract that purport to limit in whole or part your right to rely upon the subgrade information, I've got a collection of cases from around the country that I've successfully used as a matter of regular course, wherein courts have said disclaimers are not enforceable because the reality is owners, engineers give you that soils information for one reason alone, which is rely upon. And that it's not fair for the information to be given you to be rely upon, such that when the conditions are different than what you relied upon, that courts have held that you have a right to get paid. Notwithstanding that those disclaimers were included, courts conclude they're unenforceable. Again, I've got while I've got a whole host of cases around the country that support that proposition. Many states have not addressed that, so the cases that I have might only be would not be necessarily binding, but rather persuasive authority. But in any case, that's something that I have available at my disposal to assist you, as I've successfully shared that with contractors and cooperatively resolving differing site condition claims around the country when you encounter those. And there is disclamatory language. Another important question to evaluate and ask your design, or rather your bidding team, is what does the contract state with regard to your right to payment for project delay? It's often the case that the general conditions include no damage for delay clause, which is to say that if you encounter delay even caused by the project owner, while you have a right to time extension, you don't have a right to get paid for that. So you're going to want to know that when you're bidding the job, particularly if you see that there's, for example, there's a subgrade that either shows inconsistent subgrade conditions and or the subgrade has not been adequately evaluated. The project looks to you like it's been under-designed, hence the likelihood of being project delay. You want to know whether or not you have a right to get paid if your iron is being idled as a consequence of that. One note related to that is some states actually have determined as a matter of statute that such clauses, no damage for delay clause, is unenforceable. So, for example, in Minnesota, the legislatures held that the owner can purport to say whatever it says with regard to, no right to payment for delay, but those clauses are unenforceable. What's interesting about it is, notwithstanding that, public owners in Minnesota continue to include no damage for delay clauses. So unless you're knowledgeable about the statute, which I would assert most contractors are not, why would they be? The contractors are left eating the cost for project delay, notwithstanding that those clauses in Minnesota, for example, are unenforceable. Another important question to ask of the team at the bidding phase is, do I have a right to get paid for late utility relocation? Often the case is you do not, and you want to know that at the time of bidding. Okay, next. Again, questions to be asking yourself when bidding the job. Have we requested in writing from the engineer, the information, the documents that I've asked for, all subgrade investigation related documents, all utility related documents, and any related ordinances. Mindful of the fact that the engineer is likely to not have any ordinances, so you got to make sure that if you're doing your own, evaluation, part of simply punching into Google and the bid phase to see whether or not there are any ordinances that affect any of the utilities that are listed as potentially in the area that have to be relocated. You want to make sure that when you're bidding, certainly as a sub, that you've requested from the GC formally all of the subgrade information documents. I've seen it happen 2 times where when the GC is seeking a bid from a sub, it's giving you the technical specs that relate to the scope of work for which the GC wants a price, but isn't necessarily giving you not only all the subgrade related information that it received as part of the contract documents, but also the special and supplemental conditions. So your standard operating procedure has to ensure that you've got a document created in your system that where you just got to punch in the project name, the GC name, where you're sending out as a matter of standard operating procedure before sending a bid, please confirm in writing that you've provided for me for this project, one, all utility, or rather all subgrade information that you either been provided to you as a GC or otherwise been made available, as well as to all the special supplemental conditions, as well as all the contract documents generally. An important related point is sometimes engineers will not specifically provide the subgrade information, but rather include a clause that says it's available upon request. And that clause, it can very easily slip by you. You use some vulgar language because it's so inappropriate to not include it. But again, that's another reason why you need to make sure when you're evaluating the contract documents, one, that you have them all. Two, if you get them by sent by disk or whatever it is, you should be able to just put in as part of a circle or control F, press F, put in the term subgrade information, key terms to find out whether or not that clause is in there. But again, as part of your standard request from a GC for a project, you need to make sure that you're requesting not only that the GC provide all the information, but that the subgrade information that was provided with the contract documents, but also all that same information that's available upon request if it was not provided. because then the GC is responsible if it didn't ask for it, and that it was available upon request, that the GC bears the risk of that, not you. And you obviously going to need to make sure, as part of your duty to conduct a subgrade, or not subgrade, a site-specific investigation, you need to make sure that you've done that. I will tell you, as a matter of law, the site investigation, site spelled SITE, is traditionally reviewed or viewed throughout the country as only requiring a SIGHT investigation. In other words, you're required to evaluate, as part of your site investigation, that what you can see above grade, as well as that what you can see by way of subgrade information that is provided in paper, soil borings, subgrade or soils report, etc. So we need to make sure that you've conducted that site investigation. And if in fact it was not possible, let's say, for example, I'm doing it when there's snow on the ground, or the area is flooded, and therefore you can't evaluate what the existing conditions are by way of a site SIGHT investigation. You need to be, in my opinion, conversing with the engineer, writing, how do I bid the job insofar as my ability to do a site investigation is, limited in whole or in part by way of the snow, standing water, etc. Okay, next. And then you want to look at specifically, what does the contract require for an on-site investigation? Again, I've told you generally, what a site investigation requires. However, sometimes the contract can require something more than that. Like, for example, in North Carolina, if you're bidding a job that incorporates the North Carolina DOT specs, you cannot rely upon any soils information that the DOT or another body, if they're incorporating the DOT specs, provides. I don't know what the purpose of it is if you can't rely upon it, but the specs say you can't. And therefore, if you're bidding a job with the North Dakota DOT specs, you've got to conduct your own subgrade investigation. Similarly, I helped a contractor on a utility project that we successfully resolved a DSC claim in Texas, where, unbeknownst to the contractor, the technical specs said that if the soil borings were not in the general location of the utility work, that the contractor did not have a right to rely upon the borings and had to conduct its own investigation. Fortunately, the borings were, in our opinion, as we successfully asserted, in the general location, and hence we had a right to rely upon them. But again, you need to make sure at the bidding phase you're evaluating, what does the contract state with regard to what your subgrade investigation must entail, and whether and to what extent you have a right to rely upon the information that's provided. What's happened sometimes is a contractor runs into unanticipated subgrade conditions, and the engineer shoots back, hey, you could have and should have found out about those conditions if you conducted your own subgrade investigation. Response to that is a matter of law. One, if the contract, three things. One, generally you're not required to conduct your own subgrade investigation. Two, if the contract gives you a right but not an obligation to conduct a subgrade investigation, you're still not required to conduct your own subgrade investigation. The only time you're required to conduct a subgrade investigation is if, three, the contract expressly provides it. But based upon 40 years of doing this work, I have seen that in less than one hand worth of times. So it's not required. And by the way, while I've heard sometimes contractors conducting their own subgrade investigation, though it's not required, keep in mind the problematic aspect of that. If you conduct your own subgrade investigation and encounter conditions that are different than what are shown in the soils investigation that was conducted by the owner, you don't have a right to rely upon it, the soils information, soils investigation. So, and then that puts you in a position that, how do you bid the job? Because if you're bidding on the basis of the conditions that are not shown, I guess the upside might be if you find conditions that are better than anticipated, it might allow you to bid the job cheaper and therefore get it. The downside is if you encounter conditions that are different than what the owner showed, and they're you should have and could have known about those by way of your own. Well, I mean, I suppose if you encounter conditions that are more expensive to work in, you certainly want all the other bidders to know that, because in that situation, you cannot bid the job on the basis of what these soil borings show that the owners provided, when in fact your own borings showed conditions that are different and more expensive to work on. So therefore, there's an up and a downside. If you conduct your own subgrade investigation that shows the conditions are better, that can allow you to give a cheaper price, and hence on public work give it a lower price and get it. But again, if the conditions that it shows are different than and more expensive to work in than what the owner's soil boring said, if you make a DSC claim and the owner finds out that you already knew about those by way of your own subgrade investigation, you would not have a right as a matter of law to assert a DSC claim. Again, the next one is, hey, you got to make sure at the pre-bid phase you're getting all the contract documents. And again, standard operating procedure, you should be asking for those in a standard document that you have in your software system from the owner, or rather from the GC. All right. Next, and again, you want to just make sure you've got all those documents assembled for the team bidding. Okay. Questions for the sub to ask the GC, as we were talking about, and I've gone through this. You want to make sure that you've asked for and received all of the soils information, special conditions. As I've said, special supplemental conditions are so important, because that's where the owner discloses as a matter of standard practice your right to rely upon the subgrade information. Last category is, it's important to recognize that for some projects, there's a question and answer that takes place prior to the bidding. I just have a job right now that I'm working on where important information was provided as part of that Q&A. And while the GC knew about it because it was involved as part of, actively involved in that, with the engineer, if I was a sub or otherwise potentially another, the question and answer should be included as part of the contract documents, whether it's treated as a contract document, otherwise included with it. But you just want to make sure that if you're a sub, that if to the extent that there's any question and answer that's project specific, ask for it as part of your standard request in writing to the GC, to ask for it and to make sure it's provided to you. Okay, next. All right, we're at the pre-con phase, and again, as a sort of starting point, any and all of the questions that I recommended you ask that should be asked at the pre-bid phase. Certainly it should be asked, if not at the pre-bid phase, the pre-con phase. And ideally, you're asking those questions before you go into the actual pre-construction meeting. But if not, prior to that, certainly make sure you're getting these questions asked and answered at the pre-con phase, and make sure that to the extent that there's asked and answered, be it prior to the pre-con or at the pre-con, you got to make sure both the question and the answer is in writing. Being mindful of it, if it's being asked at the pre-con meeting, too often, the important information that's generated during that pre-con are not included in writing. Often those, because the general contractor fits in charge of making the meeting minutes for the pre-con or otherwise for the engineer, they're not including it. And I'd say, as a matter of course, key information is not included in those pre-con meeting minutes. So you need to make sure, one, you're reviewing those pre-con meeting minutes, and two, if there's important information that was shared during that meeting, that you do a follow-up email right away to make sure that the meeting minutes are supplemented to include important information that was not included but was discussed during that. Key questions that the GC needs to be asking for itself prior to the pre-con as part of the schedule related preparation. What does the contract say with regard to the format for the schedule? Do I need to do it in the Primavera? More and more, that's a shift around the country. The bar chart, is becoming a primitive relative. So again, if it's Primavera, if you don't know it, you need to learn it. If you got questions about it, I can help you. I know a lot about Primavera, help contractors prepare it. In fact, on a big Colorado DOT project where there was a pay item in preparation of the schedule. I worked with the GEC as a consultant on that project. It was a 2-year project. So I'm familiar not only for preparation of it, but also how to update it. What does the contract say with regard to is a schedule narrative required? Got some big DOT projects right now in Kansas where you're required as part of that for the GC to include a narrative at the outset and a narrative as part of your monthly updates. Keep in mind also what does the contract say, if any, with regard to any limitations on durations, number of activities. I've seen a lot of DOT specs that limit how long an activity can be, how short it can be from a durational standpoint. I've seen DOT specs that limit the number of activities that you can include in the schedule. You need to make sure you're reviewing as a GC, being in charge of the schedule prep, all the applicable technical specifications, as well as how often should the schedule be updated. And by the way, at a minimum, it should be updated monthly without regard to what the contract requires. And certainly when any of the sequencing of the activity, the durations are changing, you should be doing an update. Because the best way to measure the impact of a change in schedule is to update it right at the start of the event, the change event, and right at the end of the event. Updating at the start of it will indicate what the project would look like from a cost and a time standpoint. If we didn't have a change, updating it at the end of the change will measure the extent to which in time and therefore dollars, the particular activities were changed in terms of being, for example, extended, work not being able to start. And therefore you can, by using updates on a timely basis, you can measure the impact both in time and dollars and really give yourself a much, much better means to cooperatively and fairly resolve issues related to time. And if I'm a sub, I'm, even though I'm not in charge of the schedule prep, I got to make sure that I'm working with the GC to ensure that that schedule is updated, on a timely basis, and certainly at the start and the finish of a change event. And with the pre-con phase, I got to make sure for the GC, I'm having the engineer review and tell me whether or not that as planned schedule is suitable. Some specs actually require review by the engineer, whether it's required or not. You want to have the engineer review it and have the engineer state at the pre-con whether or not the engineer finds it acceptable, or at a minimum does not find any problems in the schedule logic, and make sure that exchange is reflected in the meeting minutes. What's important about that is the extent that you've got buy-in from the GC, the engineer, and ideally the subs of the project as planned with that schedule. To the extent that you run into changes that affect the schedule later, it's a lot easier to fairly and cooperatively resolve because you already got agreement on what the baseline should look like in terms of time, durations, as well as sequencing. You got to make sure that as part of the GC's prep of the schedule, as planned schedule, that the estimator shares his or her as-bid assumptions, e.g. planned durations with the PM. I've seen too many projects where the estimator does not do that. In other words, the estimator gets a job on a public job, it's low, hopefully not too low, and the project's handed over to the PM, then the PM's in charge of preparing an as-planned schedule, and shockingly to me, often the PM is not in consultation with the estimator in terms of for each of the activities, be it self-performed or subbed out, what are the as-bid and therefore assumed durations, as well as sequencing for each of the relevant activities. Okay, next. These are questions for the sub to be asking the GC. This really relates to subcontract negotiations. First, as a matter of law, subs have a right to negotiate the terms of a proposed subcontract. In other words, when you give your bid to a GC, if the GC relies upon it in formulation of its bid to the owner, while the GC has a right to require you to perform the work at that price that the GC relied upon, assuming that it did, that's the extent of the enforceable agreement. That, in other words, whether you sign a subcontract or not, if the GC relied upon your bid in submitting a successful bid to the owner, the GC has a right to enforce your right to, or it's your obligation to perform the work at that price for the stated scope of work. However, once you get that proposed standard subcontract, it includes all sorts of other clauses, rights, obligations that were not part of the GC's initial solicitation for a price. All of those additional clauses, as a matter of law, are treated as a counteroffer that you can either accept or reject. And therefore, you have a right that you certainly owe to exercise to review and revise that proposed subcontract in a way to reflect a fair allocation of rights and obligations. And the beauty is, if you're doing it with a GC that you're regularly working for, once you've revised the subcontract to an acceptable level that works for both you and the GC and you as a sub for that project, when you work with that GC again, you shouldn't have to revise it again. You just use a template that you created on an earlier project. And I can tell you, to the extent that I work with subs around the country, often behind the scenes, but sometimes if I have to come out from behind the scenes, GCs are very, very willing to work with you to revise the subcontract. Why? Because all of the changes that I'm proposing for you to make as a sub with the GC relate to a fair allocation of rights and obligations. So, for example, a standard subcontract from a GC will say, if you delay the GC, you owe the GC dollars. If the GC delays you, it owes you time only. Well, that's not fair. I mean, if the GC delays you, just like if you delay the GC, you should have both of you should have the same right to get paid for it. Similarly, right for payment. That's an example. I mean, there's all sorts of other examples. I've given some important ones here. I don't want to go into them, but each of these are examples of clauses that you owe to ensure that at a minimum you're examining, evaluating, and proposing fair revisions that reflect a fair, balanced allocation of rights and obligations as between you, the sub, and you as a GC. And for the GCs, when I prepare standard subcontracts for them, I can tell the subs, it's more of a one-sided subcontract. So you as a sub need to ensure that when you're getting what's often, a rather one-sided subcontract, you exercise your right to ensure that it's not one-sided, therefore get reasonable, fair revisions to ensure a balanced subcontract. Okay, next. Here are questions that at the construction phase you need to be asking again, as you should have been asking at the bid phase. What does the contract state with regard to your rights as it relates to project changes? Changes in the scope of work, i.e. extra work, changes in the type of work. Is there a differing site condition clause? What does the contract say with regard to payment for extra work? What is it? Is there a clause that relates to substantial change in the work, be it based on quantities or be it based on how the work is performed? You want to have those contract rights for project changes are going to be reflected in the general as well as supplemental special conditions. So be it as a GC or a sub, you got to be evaluating those contract clauses prior to starting work. Similarly, you want to make sure you're aware of what are the procedural obligations related to your right to additional time and or dollars for project changes. I will tell you, one thing that we've done for contractors, be it GCs and subs around the countries, is prepared flow charts that help you. So to the extent you're dealing with standard general conditions on a regular basis, be it the EJ, CDAC, DOT specs, AIA, we prepare flow charts in order that you've got those available not only for your PM and home office, but also for your foreman on the job site. And you don't have to keep recreating the wheel or wondering what your rights are. You want to value as well as corresponding obligations. You want to make sure that both home office and field are aware of the applicable rights as well as obligations for changes. And here's the fourth one's a really important one. Does your software track the cost of idle resources? I will tell you my experience around the country is generally contractors, both GC as well as subs, only track the costs of resources when they're being used and not idle. And that's one of the reasons why when iron's idle, contractors practice it typically not to get paid for it because they're not even tracking the cost of idle iron or idle labor, even though that cost is huge. Generally, as a matter of law around the country, the cost of idle resources for equipment is half the operator rate. Pretty significant. Similarly, it's generally true that at least I've been successful at getting contractors paid for idle labor. If you cannot, utilize that labor like equipment on another project, because, given how tight the market is, you're generally not sending your people home if a project is delayed. If you're idle and not able to continue to prosecute your work, so you got to pay them. And to the extent that that's standard practice and having to pay them, it's also standard practice based upon my experience of your right to get paid not only for idle iron, but also for idle personnel. All right, next. Questions for engineers. Again, these are all of this relates to questions that you should have asked at the pre-bid phase. And if you're not asking for it, then you should be asking for it, at the pre-con phase, and certainly no later than the pre-construction conference itself. I've gone through all these. Another important to ask, at the pre-construction phase is, hey, has the owner, done everything it needs to in order for the work to start? For example, does the owner have all the required easements? Sometimes a reason for the delay. Has the NTP, the notice to proceed, been issued? If it's not, when is the owner anticipated being received? Similarly, you got to make sure, after the job's awarded, you got to make sure that, or rather, if you're the GC, the project's red low, you got to make sure that you stay on top of not only getting all of your contract documents signed, returned, including payment and performance bonds, but you got to also make sure that you get the owner to execute those contract documents and get into your possession. I've had many projects where the contractor is delayed at the outset because the owner is taking too long to get the contract documents executed. And unfortunately, a lot of the contracts provide that, the owner has up to 90, 120 days to get those documents executed without you having a corresponding right to a time extension or payment for related extra costs. For example, if work that should have started earlier, it gets pushed into cold, wet weather, otherwise adverse conditions. So, be it as a GC or as a sub, you got to make sure that once someone's red low, or if you're a sub, you're told you're going to do the work, you got to make sure the owner's getting the required contract documents executed in order you can get that NTP issued. Okay, next. Conclusion. Hopefully one thing you take is, for subgrade work, there's the greatest risk in my experience around the country for both vertical and horizontal construction, for there to be risks that are attendant to that aren't necessarily attendant to other aspects of vertical and horizontal construction. It's critical for you to recognize those questions and to get those questions asked and answered on a timely basis, because those questions are going to relate to how I price the work for what's anticipated, whether I should price the work at all, i.e. to submit a bid, and if so, what's the likelihood I'm going to have unanticipated work, changed work, as well as what rights do I have to get paid for those anticipated aspects of work, be it different or changed, and ensure that my bid is, informed by that when I proceed. Again, all this is, managing the risks associated with planned, unplanned costs, as well as your right to get paid for unplanned events. So hopefully this provides valuable guidance, and you get that I'm passionate, really helping to make your lives better and helping you to manage risk better. So thanks a lot. Hopefully today was beneficial. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Let's now open the webinar to questions. You can use the chat feature to submit a question, and I'll read the question to the presenter. Or if you prefer, unmute yourself, state your name and company, and ask the question directly. Remember to remute yourself after you finish. And we have one question here from Tyler Bird on Soils Report. Tyler, can you unmute yourself and ask the question? You're going to be able to phrase it better than I can. If you're still on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out which button to click.
All you got it. We hear you.
All right, wonderful. Hey, so a lot of times what I find is that they incorporate a Soils report as a reference point, but basically it's not. We're not able to actually use it for or justifying any additional costs. And I just kind of wanted to. This was a spec section that one of our contracts has in it. And it says that this report and other records of subsurface investigation and tests are provided only for inspection by bidders. It is understood and agreed that such subsurface information, whether included in the plans and specifications or otherwise made available to the bidder, was obtained and intended for the county's design and estimating purposes only. Bidder expressly waives any right to rely on such information for any purpose. So like, say we encounter differing subsurface conditions, we can't actually point to this document. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so really good question, and relates an area we talked about. I mean, that's a pretty broad disclaimer. I mean, that's what it is. This is a disclaimer's part. I mean, and what's bold about it, and excuse me for again bold language, if it was only for design purposes only, why the heck did they give it to bidders, to contractors bidding on it? Because obviously it's being given for you to rely upon. And indeed, I don't know what jurisdiction this is arising in, but, there are many state as well as federal court and construction board decisions that have ruled such disclaimers like that are unenforceable because, again, the information wouldn't have been given to you but for the intention for you to rely upon it. And, having said that, if I'm deciding whether to bid that job, and if so, I would be asking in writing, at the pre-bid phase, the engineer, how should I bid the job? Should I bid it on the basis of the subgrade conditions that are shown, or should I include a contingency in my bid to cover the possibility of encountering conditions different than what are shown? Because of the, and I would also be asking in writing, if I encounter conditions that are different, are you saying, to clarify, are you saying I don't have a right to get paid for it? And another question that I would ask is, if I'm not to rely upon that information, and I'll try not to swear, why the blank did you give me that information at the time that I am to bid the job? What is the purpose of me getting that information if not to rely upon? That would be an important question to ask to clarify it, as well as you might very well get information in response to that if you necessarily did rely upon it. I mean, it's hard to bid on a job and not and ignore what the subgrade project specific information says. That the answer that I get from the engineer might very well make it easier for me to get around a disclaimer like that if I ran into different site conditions. I would also add, Tyler, that sometimes you'll get a disclaimer that's not as broad, that it might say, for example, the soils information is provided for information only. The soils information is not a contract document. Even if you have subgrade information or disclaimers like that, and frankly, Tyler, even with the disclaimer that you're talking about, you still might be able to get around it. And I've successfully done that by arguing that we still have a right to utilize that information as the best information of what the anticipated subgrade information, as what the anticipated subgrade conditions would be. And if you look at a standard differing site condition clause, and they're pretty standard around the country, there's two parts to it. There's what's called a type 1 and a type 2. A type 1 says under the standard DSC clauses that you have a right to extra dollars if you encounter conditions different. That's what's indicated in the contract documents. What the second part of it says is you have a right to additional dollars if you encounter conditions different than what was anticipated for the work of the kind in this general location. I've successfully helped contractors, again, cooperatively get payment in the face of a disclaimer like what you're talking about, by having the contractor working behind the scenes arguing that, okay, notwithstanding the disclaimatory language you included, can we not agree that that soils information nonetheless provided the best information as to what the anticipated work of the kind being done at this project location would be? Because when we've taken that approach, the engineer is required to say yes, right? I mean, what else is the engineer going to say but yes? Okay, if you agree with me that it's the best information as to the anticipated subgrade conditions for this project specifically, tell me then why that does not provide then the basis for me to get paid for what's called a type 2 differing site condition, which is type 2 being the second part of the differing site condition clause. Does that make sense? And if you run into that, for you or anybody else, I can give you the roadmap as part of the first call free, how to successfully take that approach.
I want to thank Tom Olson for his time today to generously present this information to our webinar guests. Today's webinar has been recorded. A recording of this webinar will be made available on NUCA's YouTube channel over the next few days. A PDF of Tom's PowerPoint will be sent to all attendees, and a link will be provided in next week's NUCA at Work. And thank you for your time today to join us for this special industry webinar and for supporting NUCA. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of the week.